So, Mr. President, first, thank you very much for taking your precious time and accept our interview. You assume President of General Assembly during a very critical time. We have challenges in multiple fronts. We have the challenges of security and peace. We have the challenges in climate crisis, as well as elimination of poverty. So, what do you think is your priority during your presidency?
There's absolutely no doubt that there are several challenges out there. You're quite right. Peace and security, there's a climate crisis, there's a global food crisis, and there's poverty and hunger. There's also a major deficit in development. And that is going to be one of the top priorities of this presidency. As you know, the Secretary General will be convening the SDG Summit next week with a view to having heads of state and government recommit to the SDGs and to make hopefully bold contributions towards getting the SDGs back on track. There are too many people across the globe who are suffering and who need the help, the urgent help of the United Nations and of the General Assembly. And that is certainly going to figure as one of the more prominent priorities under my presidency. But, you know, I hesitate in a way to speak of priorities because there are lots of challenges out there. Peace and security is a challenge in various parts of the world. Human rights is a challenge in various parts of the world. Gender equality is a challenge in various parts of the world. What the presidency will therefore be working on is a broad agenda of issues that are in urgent need of being addressed and that will require the contribution, the support, and the collaboration of all members of the international community in order to find workable solutions to these problems.
So, we know that nowadays many people they are kind of skeptical about the role of the United Nations as well as multilateralism. As President of General Assembly, what's your plan to revive the confidence of people on the United Nations and multilateralism?
Skepticism towards the United Nations and multilateralism is certainly not new. But you're quite right, there has been a sort of sharpening of that point of view in the recent past, unfortunately so. Let me emphasize that the United Nations is an extremely large organization comprised of many subsidiary organizations that do extraordinarily good work on the ground in countries to help and support populations in distress or in need. We have agencies like the World Food Programme, for example, and the FAO that are involved in ensuring that world food supplies are adequate. So the World Health Organization. So one has to be very careful with this allegation of skepticism towards the United Nations. I think what people tend to focus on primarily is what happens with the Security Council of the United Nations, what decisions the Security Council takes, and why sometimes it appears that the Security Council is unable or unwilling to take decisions in sometimes very daunting circumstances that directly impact people's lives. With respect to the question of regaining trust and confidence in the United Nations, I think as the UN, we need to demonstrate to our constituencies that we have the capacity to take decisions in areas that directly impact the lives of people. and that can make a sea change to the international system. We have to be able to take those decisions. Some of them are very difficult decisions, but we cannot avoid them. The longer we avoid, the more complex the problems become, a la climate change. Postponing indefinitely what needs to be done means inevitably that the price we pay gets larger and larger. And the images we see all around the world of the impact of climate change, just as an example, indicates that this problem needs to be addressed frontally and with much degree of urgency. So what we'll be doing is mobilizing to facilitate better decision making on the part of the UN, and ensuring that when the UN gives commitments, it honors those commitments by way of building trust both within and without the organization. Because the UN does need the support of the general public, as indeed does the public need the engagement and the power of the UN to help to make a difference in their lives.
Mr. President, recently we saw a trend of more and more developing countries take center stage and become more vocal about current affairs, current issues. What do you think of this trend, and how would this trend of developing countries could help the role of the UN?
I'm sure you're aware that when the UN was launched in the late 1940s, there were not many developing countries around. That has changed significantly in the period of decolonization. Now we have a situation where at least half of the countries who are members of the United Nations are in fact developing countries. The so-called Group of 77 and China is the largest regional group in the UN. It's the group of developing countries. And it is all well and good that developing countries need to have a voice in issues and in making policy that affects them directly. All countries need to have a voice. That is why inclusion is such an important dimension of the philosophy of the United Nations and of the General Assembly, that it must make room for and admit countries at all levels of development, in all political systems, in order to ensure that they are represented at the table and they feel comfortable with the outcomes. They can take ownership of decisions to which they have made valid contributions. Developing countries, therefore, have the right and they have the opportunity to engage in this dialogue with their counterparts. That is the nature of multilateral diplomacy. It's an engagement and, in a sense, a battle of ideas. So it's not a question of the big ones getting their way or the small ones being marginalized. There are instances when working collaboratively and purposively, great progress can be made by small countries and have been made in informing public policy at the level of the international system. For example, my own country, Trinidad and Tobago, several years ago, was in the vanguard of the movement for the establishment of the International Criminal Court. There was a lot of pushback regarding the notion of establishing such a court. The court now exists and is fully functional. Many developing countries supported that initiative. In the same way, the law of the sea, we've recently had the BBNJ negotiated. Developing countries played a critical role, the G77 and China, in that process. We're here, we are part of the international system. We are integral parts of the international system. And we want to make a contribution that is valid and that is going to shape the system in a way that caters not simply to the interests of some, but to the interests of all. A great prospect in strengthening the basis for peace and security.
What is your expectation for China's role in the United Nations?
Well, there's no doubt about it. China is an important player in the system. I would venture to say a leader in the system, an important leader. It's a member of the P5 of the Security Council, and a key player in the system. To a significant degree, China often speaks on behalf of developing countries on some issues. Its long history and experience, I think, gives it a role and a level of respect that is very well established in the UN. And I will look forward to China, given its stature in the international system, to be able to use its stature and its prowess responsibly in a way that would bring benefit to the entire system and to the international community as a whole.
Your Excellency, thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank
again.
you.
Thank you.